Hi guys, my name's Tom and welcome to the channel. So I've been really quiet here on YouTube recently. Quite a few sort of false starts with getting back to really being a bit more consistent with the channel. So I've had lots of different projects on, and I was actually lucky enough to be out in Kenya with a really fun project, painting some pieces for a map for a safari lodge and also their leaflet, lots of different wildlife in that, and loads of other little projects going on like studio sales, commissions, that sort of thing. So excuses aside, I've always had getting back onto YouTube with much more consistency, sharing a lot more on here has kind of been on the horizon, and I think I'm going to finally have some space to kind of ease back into it. And I want to start off today with a video using a couple of my past paintings from my Patreon account to talk about painting markings on wildlife. So I think this is a really fun subject. It's a really great topic because quite often the markings appear fairly obvious as to how we should paint them, but actually there's quite a few little tips and kind of tricks that we can use them to accentuate and exaggerate the form of our subject, and we can also use the tone and the colour of them to kind of further accentuate the feeling of light as well. So that's what I want to talk about here. It's still relatively simple tips, but just a few can go a long way. Let's have a look at some theory and then I'll show you a couple of paintings with that theory in action.
So my main considerations when painting markings are what happens as we transition from a shadow area into a light area. So for me, the first thing to think about is tonal values. So when we look at a subject or a photo, it may appear, and it may actually be, that the markings are the same tone in the light side as in the shadow side. But what I tend to do to purposely accentuate the form and enhance the feeling of roundness of a subject is very simply make the markings lighter in the light area, darker in the shadow area. It sounds really simple, but I've taught so many students that don't do this, and it can flatten out a subject. There may be times that it might be useful, but on the whole I tend to make markings darker and the shadows increasingly lighter as we move around the form into the light area. One little thing that often occurs is that the gentle or medium shadow of the shadow area is quite often the same sort of tone as the markings in the light area. So number one is tonal values. The next thing to think about is edges, and this comes down to a couple of little things. What comes first? Do we paint the markings and glaze over the top, or do we paint the markings wet into wet? In reality, I do a little bit of both of these things in any given subject or area. When we paint the markings first and glaze over the top, what happens is that the tonal values become condensed and very close together and give the illusion of kind of softness and fuzziness in the shadows, which we often get in nature, any subject. And then if I paint the markings a little bit more wet into wet or damp into damp to varying degrees, we naturally use the qualities of the medium to get the kind of soft fuzzy markings, and that always contrasts nicely with the kind of wet on dry work where we get more definition of the markings in the light area. And then the next thing, which obviously isn't present here, is talking about colour. So what's going to happen as we move from light into shadow? Generally, as a not a rule, but as a guide, I tend to play around with cool and warm. So I might, if I'm a little bit warmer with my colour in the light area, I might cool it down as I move into the shadows, or vice versa. I might make the colours a bit more soft and maybe slightly cooler in the light area, but then I'll kind of warm them up as we move into the shadows. It's not a hard set rule, but it's a nice little thing to think about. All the time it's this transition from light into shadow and vice versa. As it get lighter or darker, softer or more defined, and as the colour get cooler or warmer. We can really play around with those ideas. The very final thing to think about is the rhythm or the movement or the direction of these markings and the shape and the scale. So as they move around the form of an object, what kind of movement or rhythm do they have? Do they gather together in the creases or certain areas of an animal and kind of radiate or spiral out from there? We might quite often see that. And how do they change shape? You know, if a subject or marking is more face on, it might be like that. And then as we move around a form, it might get gradually more flat or slightly different shape as it moves away from us. And just for specific animals, the markings do change shape and size in different areas of the body. So for me, those are the 4 things to think about. Let's have a look at them in action. So the first thing I'm doing here is just blocking in the big shadow shapes. There's not even an underwash here. I'm just going to use the white of the page for where the light is hitting the white of the zebra. So I'm mapping in the big shadow shapes here first. Now already I'm starting to think about this interaction between the markings in shadow, both tonally and in terms of colour. So I'm taking exactly the same tone that represents the more gentle shadow, and I'm using that exact tone and warming it up to create the markings in the light area. And there will be more variation, but then the next stage is to bring in the thicker, creamier paint that's going to give us our deeper darks, and I'm dropping that into the existing gentle or medium shadow area whilst it's still damp, because I want that softness. And it's this that I'm going to chase within the shadow areas further. I'm going to keep the lights very warm, so purposely adding a lot more warm colour as in the markings in the light, cooling down exactly the same tone into the gentle shadow, and then I'm going to slowly but surely add deeper tone whilst it's still wet to get cooler, darker, softer markings within the shadow areas. So the reason I'm going elsewhere to paint is that I'm letting the shadow on the left hand side kind of dry off a little bit. You have to excuse my head getting in the way of the shot. So now there's still a slight dampness to the shadow area here, so I'm going in with much thicker, creamier paint, cooler, so there's much more kind of greeny bias to it, a lot of phthalo blue and a lot of aureolin yellow, and I'm kind of continuing the warm light markings from the light area into the shadows, and it's, as I said, all about that timing so that I get that softness. So it always comes back to what's the tonal shift from shadow to light, what's the colour shift from shadow to light, and generally trying to get a little bit more definition within the light areas, a little bit softer and more wet into wet, damp into damp work within the shadows. So again, same principle here. Notice how I've warmed up the markings on the right hand side of the body, cooled exactly the same tone down with lots of blue, even some turquoise as we go into the shadow. And whilst that shadow is beginning to dry, depending on the timing and how wet it is, I use thicker, creamier paint to drop in the markings, get that lovely softness all the time. Cool, warm, light and shadow, soft and hard edges. These are all of the simple ways that we can create contrast. And then I'm thinking about the contrast in relation to the subject and what I'm trying to achieve. So here, as I'm sharpening up this area, for me it gets too defined. I'm overstating things. So you can see that I pull a lot of the pigment out and then I wash a little bit more of a shadow in there. So I'm trying to keep it simple, which is very hard when there's so much going on. So I keep the underlying patterns of light and shadow extremely simple, probably a lot more simple than most other subjects. So that when I put the markings on, it doesn't get too complicated. I'm not trying to get every single subtle variation of tone and variegation within the shadows. The watercolour itself will create a lot of that variety and that variegation and that subtlety just because of its natural properties, and those natural properties really shine when we work a little bit more wet into wet. But you can see now with the background, I'm starting to trap those little lights, use the negative shape of the background to form the positive shape of the zebra. But my main hope here is that you can see, whilst there is lots of variation and it's not as simple as just very dark markings in the shadows, the markings are significantly darker in the shadows but still with variegation. Lighter in the light areas, obviously, much cooler in the shadows, purposely much warmer in the lights, and then in the shadows I've worked much more wet into wet, which has created those soft fuzzy edges, and then where the markings are in the light I've worked wet over dry, so we get more definition, all the time playing with those principles.
So don't forget guys, if you are enjoying this video, you like the look of these particular paintings, the full length version is actually over on my watercolour school, my online watercolour school. I do have a Patreon account, but it really only has a little bit of acrylic stuff on. I've moved everything watercolour over onto the school. So these will be in the Patreon archive. So these are filmed by myself. So there's still lots of fantastic content in there, but it's kind of a slightly lesser quality, for example, than all of the current professionally filmed tutorials that are up over on the school. That's kind of a whole nother level of production, which has been really fun and really exciting. There's also a fantastic online community there, which is really buzzing at the moment. And there's a new tutorial every 2 weeks, lots of techniques and tips, and we've got some big plans for the school moving forward, so definitely hop over and check it out. The link is in the description. It's just the sort of thing, whatever your level or experience, if you're looking to kind of break through or take your paintings to the next level, that's what I've designed the school for.
So whilst the same principles are obviously at play here, I approach this one quite differently. So I'm laying down the light family. So this is anywhere where the light is hitting, and that's made up of the whites of the page and also very, very light, kind of warmish yellowy colours. Now whilst that's still damp, I'm dropping in much more strong consistency of slightly warmer colour, so more in the kind of red and orange realm, but still very much in the light family. This is to create a bit of variety of tone and variegation of colour, but within like the tonal range that represents the lights, and it's going to add depth and a bit of interest. It's kind of laying the foundations of light and shadow in a very subtle way to then put now the markings on top. So these represent the markings on the light side, hence why I'm not doing them as really strong blacks. They're still notably darker than the lighter tone that's underneath. And notice also I'm playing around with kind of colour temperature a little bit. Some of them are a little bit warmer with some kind of quinacridone red and a little blue. Some have much more kind of lavender thrown in to really cool them down even more. And I'm kind of taken that cue from my subject. So it's not that we're copying our subject exactly, but we're also not completely disregarding our subject. We're using it to give us some visual cues and some ideas about how to tackle this. So that represents a lot of the markings in the light, and notice how I've warmed them up and darkened them ever so slightly as they go round to the right hand side of the head as we look at it, just to create a bit more of that kind of roundness. So cooler in this case and lighter on the left side, moving around to darker and warmer on the right side. As I go into the shadows, I'm making the shadow tone actually very, very warm. So in this one, not really like the photo, I've ended up having sort of very washed out, slightly cooler colours in the lights. And as I move into the shadow, I'm now making the colours very, very rich and relatively warmer. There's kind of soft oranges and pinks and reds in the shadows. So colour temperature is always relative, like it's relatively warm compared to the relatively cooler colours and tones are in the light side. So now we're getting into the same principle as the zebra though. So I've laid in the big shadow tone, it just happens to be over the top of some existing colour. Now whilst that's damp, I'm dropping in the markings. Depending on timing of the wetness of the page, mixed with the paint consistency in my brush, the level to which these markings kind of fuzz and soften into the surrounding area will vary. Obviously stronger paint consistency in a more dry area will be more defined, more moisture on the page and a slightly kind of more milky or creamy consistency of paint rather than thick. The markings will soften in a little bit more. And what I tend to do then is try and be quite selective, and you may have seen me do this earlier on, but I'm being very selective about which markings I kind of define further and darken a little bit more. So it's not every single marking getting defined to the same degree. Some get strengthened and defined a little bit more, others are left to kind of drift in and out of focus, if that makes sense. And then beyond that, I'm just starting now to carve out the positive shape of the animal using the negative dark shapes of the background. And the only other point I want to make is notice how I've tried to make a lot of the markings not similar in shape. So as humans, we tend to recreate the same shape over and over again and create patterns when we don't want to. Whilst there is a rhythm and a movement and a similarity to the markings, at the same time I don't want everyone to be the same shape, the same size. So I'm trying to create a more random feeling to the markings. Yet within that I'm also considering the way that they are moving around the form of the animal. Look how they change size, look how they change shape. and look at the way that they kind of move and spiral out from certain places to create kind of the rhythm of the markings and accentuate the form and the shape of the animal. So this all comes back to those same principles. We've got a colour temperature change from light to shadow. We've got a tonal change from light to shadow. And we've got these more defined markings in the light areas created by working wet over dry. And we've got those softer, out of focus, fuzzy and lost markings and lost edges within the shadows by painting more wet into wet or damp into damp. So it always comes back to those principles. I've not been so rigid here about the lights must only be warmer or the shadows must only be cooler or vice versa. I've just played around with colour temperature a little bit more. It doesn't always have to be so rigid, particularly with watercolour, where we can have a lot of fun and be very creative with it.
Alright guys, I hope you enjoyed that. I hope it gave you some good information to think about tackling markings on wildlife. Exactly the same thing applies to painting birds, markings on birds, and actually it applies to painting tattoos on people as well. Anything where you've got form with markings on it, even a watermelon, something like that. So that's it guys, don't forget to check out the Online Watercolour School and all of the other little places you can find me, all of the links in the description. Until next time, happy painting, and I will see you soon.